So, okay, well, let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to do the introduction. So thanks everybody for joining us. It's our second ever online only ecology natural resource seminar series. We've got two speakers. So Alex Mathis has a BS in forestry and forest wildlife management from Stephen F. Austin University. He's a certified professional wetland scientist, certified forester, and a certified GIS professional. He's been in the field for over 16 years and says he's obsessed with sailing. He used to live on a sailboat and traveled to the Caribbean by boat once. Sounds pretty cool. Nathan Weaver has a BS and an MS in wildlife and fisheries biology from Clemson, and he's an associate wildlife biologist through the Wildlife Society. He's been consulting for the last year and a half, and previously he was a forester for Georgia Department of Natural Resources. He admits to not being as cool as Alex, but he does run ultramarathons and the Ironman, and says he dabbles in alpine climbing, which is where he is now, I guess. And I'm exhausted just reading about their extracurriculars, but maybe staying at home has made me soft. I do want to mention that Nathan earned his MS at Clemson in my lab. He worked on stream salamanders in the Appalachians and did a terrific job. He's a great grad student. He's published both of his chapters already on the work he did that explored neighborhood age on the effect of neighborhood age on stream and riparian organisms. So that's out there if anybody wants to read more about that. All right, so with that, I'll turn it over to Nathan and Alex.
I hope everybody can hear me. If you can't, feel free to shoot me a message, tell me to talk louder or get closer to the screen. This is the first time I've done a Zoom meeting where I've actually had to talk. I actually didn't start using Zoom until this quarantine, and my gym has been doing the fitness classes via Zoom meeting. So I've had started my crash course just a couple weeks ago. But Alex and I today are going to talk about environmental consulting, and not only that, but adaptive environmental consulting. We feel that our company really tries to be on the cutting edge and learn from the best science available and kind of push boundaries in this field. So I think you guys talk about adaptive management and adaptive things in school, so figured I'd throw that in there. I guess Kyle already did my bio, and Alex, do you have anything you want to add, or are you happy?
Yeah, thanks everybody for letting me join. I would say that to Nathan's credit, he does have really funny jokes, so where I may be cooler, he has some.
I just can't tell any of them
jokes,
today
so,
legally.
No, they're great, and no, my field vest in my picture is not undersized, but I got some good hiking during that field trip in Nevada, so by the end of the project, it was proper size. So
yeah, so that was an old photo, Alex. I should like that. Should have used a more recent one. So yeah, what we're going to talk about today, I know when I was at Clemson, I did not, even in graduate school, I'd never really heard of environmental consulting except for the people that were into bats seemed to know about it. And so I'd heard the word, but it really wasn't something I knew that was a career option for me. And so I thought it'd be kind of cool to just give a quick crash course on what exactly we do as environmental consultants. Because if you go to the job boards right now, you'll probably notice that a lot of the permanent full-time positions are consulting jobs, at least the ones that are open to the public to apply. And then I'm going to talk about a private industry project that we've been working on that started before either of us started Geosyntec, but it's a project that's very much guided by changing science and biological opinion from all kinds of different stakeholders and professionals. And then after that, Alex is going to talk about some Esri collector work and Trimble R1 stuff and ArcGIS online, which I think some of you guys, especially graduate students, might gain a lot from. That's something that we've sort of transitioned into using in the field in the past year. And then if we have time, I'll talk about some research opportunities that I think would be kind of cool within what we do. And then I'll definitely leave a little bit of time for questions. So first, what exactly is an environmental consultant? We kind of do whatever our clients need that we have a skill set for. And that could be everything from habitat restoration. We did a project in Indiana a couple of months ago, doing some restoration work. We do environmental permitting, mitigation, soil and water sampling and environment. I do a lot of environmental inspections, and I can talk about that later. And then we also do some air monitoring as well. I'm not involved with that, but I know that's a big part of what we do. But for Alex and I, our main bread and butter is environmental permitting. And a lot of that entails wetland delineation. And I know that there's at least a couple of students in here from Kyle's wetlands class. And he told me to hit on that because wetland delineation is a big part of what we do. So our environmental permitting, it starts with a client comes to us with a project and there's going to be some disturbance involved. And so we've got to determine what the level of disturbance is and what the permitting requirements are going to be with a bunch of different agencies, state wildlife agencies, Fish and Wildlife, Corps of Engineers, even local tribes. And so we start off with desktop review where we look at all the possible threatened and endangered species that are known in that area and in that county, and consult with Fish and Wildlife and South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. We also look at the aerial imagery from not just the current imagery, but even older imagery as far back as we can find, basically, and look for any visible water feature. As you know, those aerial images aren't necessarily always taken at the same time each year. And so you might catch something one year and not the next. And a lot of that involves working with GIS. I know some of you guys, if there's any undergrads in this, are probably learning GIS now, and it may not seem relevant if you are interested in wildlife. I know when I was first taking GIS, it seemed confusing and it seemed like something I wouldn't necessarily use, but I'll tell you, every job I've had, it's been very important. And it's a very good skill set to have on the tool belt.
And it also, if I can interject, it also, yeah. I'm a biologist, Nathan's biologist background, natural resource background, and GIS is a tool set, and it is something that makes us better biologists. Definitely prepares us for the field work. In the old times, I used to go out and do a very proper desktop delineation of a site, and you're just kind of going in there cold and using the tools available for using GIS, using remote sensing techniques. As Nathan mentioned, current and historical aerial imagery is great, and so it's a very valuable tool set to have and understand.
Yeah, I know you do a lot with LiDAR data, so. All right, well, and then, we go into the field, and that's where we do wetland delineation, which again, for the Corps of Engineer permitting process to be considered a wetland, it's got to involve, it's got to have hydric soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and it's got to have hydrology. So all three of those parameters have to be met in order for it to be considered a wetland. Whereas with Fish and Wildlife, it only has to meet one of them. But we, ultimately the permit goes to the Corps of Engineers. So first is soils. And again, I'm just going to touch on this briefly because it's really not the purpose of today's talk, but I figured I'd just give a crash course in it. Soils is one of the first things we look at a site. We get a soil profile and we compare basically the texture and the makeup of the soil, along with looking at the Munsell color theory to basically determine if that soil is hydric. And that's going to vary regionally. And it's going to vary based on conditions and the amount of disturbance that may occur. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Next thing we look at is vegetation. And so we have vegetative plots within our wetland data points where we identify every plant within a certain radius. And there's a wetland plant list for each region that, a plant may be a wetland plant in one region and that same species may not be a wetland plant in another region. And to meet the vegetation criteria, you have a rapid test, which basically is primarily composed of wetland obligate plants. You have a dominance test, which basically is most of the vegetation hydrophytic. And then finally, you have a prevalence test, and we won't get into all that, but that's for your more problematic sites. If it's significantly disturbed or something along those lines, maybe topsoil has been removed recently. And that question was in what are the 5 wetland indicator categories? I know you guys can't answer right now, but a plant gets basically assigned one of 5 categories. It can be upland, facultative upland, facultative wetland, or a wetland plant. That'd be an obligate wetland plant. And then hydrology is often more difficult simply because it's less objective. A lot of it does have to rely on your own professional best judgment. And so, but hydrology kind of drives everything else. It's what determines what vegetation and soils will be there. And so there's a bunch of different indicators that you look for, like crawfish burrows or, you know, saturation in the topsoil, all kinds of things like that. And know that, you know, what is a wetland in South Carolina versus what is a wetland in Louisiana versus what is a wetland in the High Sierras in the West is going to be very different. So, especially when you talk about places like the Eastern Sierras, where you might have a stream feature that doesn't ever actually connect to navigable waters. Starts in the mountains from snowmelt, maybe it's only seasonal, and then it bottoms out in the desert and dries up. And you may or may not be aware that there are proposed changes that are actually final now, but not implemented for the waters of the United States ruling that determines what's jurisdictional and what isn't. And those kinds of ecosystems are now, their status is kind of in flux. So once we get all the data, we go back to the lab and we basically we're documenting that we've done due diligence, and then we seek the relevant authorities, be that South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, or Fish and Wildlife, DNR, and we do the permitting with each individual agency. It's basically one big, long group project that never ends. So if you don't like group projects, consulting may not be your thing. So a real world example, let me check my time here. Our real world example is the multi-species habitat conservation plan. And this is one of our clients has basically a huge agreement that's with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it covers projects across basically the whole Eastern coast and Midwest. And it's all driven and informed by research, science, and data. So it's a situation where university research and state and federal agencies provided data and biological opinion that is driving private industry, I think, in a positive way. It makes it easier and better for everybody. And so we had a problem where the client is spread out against 14 different states. They have sites, you know, all over the country, different kinds of work they're doing of different scale and size, different timelines. Some projects take a few days, some projects take years. And for every little thing they're doing, they have to get a permit. And that a permit from Fish and Wildlife. And that can be very time consuming, both for the client and for Fish and Wildlife, because they essentially have a huge backlog of applications that you probably have heard about this in the news, where they can't process everything fast enough. And that's part of why this kind of thing happens. And a lot of the projects that the client has are time constrained. And so it hurts them when they have to wait for a response because of a backlog. There may be a safety issue. There may be a customer, like they're not delivering energy to the customer in time, or maybe that the contractors to do the work are only available for a certain window. And I'll get into this more later, but certain wildlife, certain species, you can only do work around their habitat during certain times of the year. And so that might limit them. And so the client, and again, this is an energy client, if you haven't guessed already, worked with Fish and Wildlife to create this multi-species habitat conservation plan. And basically it's a long-standing 50-year permit that covers certain activities. And so the idea is that one, they're trying to think about things from a landscape scale ecosystem approach rather than individual impacts and individual species populations. And two, it covers 42 different species, and just trying to kind of streamline and make things more efficient. So they're trying to make things more efficient, and they're trying to think about things from a landscape scale and a long-term scale. And so this is basically a plan that helps them do that to minimize and mitigate their anticipated work. So, and this is all driven by the Endangered Species Act. And so that's essentially what they're trying to do is meet those requirements. So that covers their incidental tank permit. Like if the client's going to do some kind of work that's going to have a negative impact on the species or possibly take some individuals, that's covered by this permit. And all of that is advised by the Fish and Wildlife Service and state agency professional input. And so what happens is the client basically came to the Fish and Wildlife Service and says, here's the 20 different things we do along this energy corridor. There's 20 different things that we do. Maybe herbicide application, mowing, excavations, tree trimming, whatever. Here's a list and a breakdown of each individual activity. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state agencies come back and say, okay, we think the impacts from each of these activities will be X, Y, and Z. And so you're approved to do A without a permit, but if you do B, then you're gonna have to get a permit for that specific thing. And so I hope I've explained that well enough. And so that's for each specific task, and it varies depending on what species are present. So now they don't need a permit for every single project. And I can't emphasize enough that it's not that they're skirting regulations, it's that they're streamlining things that like they don't have to do a permit now for every time they mow a pipeline, which they're going to do every year. So
yeah, it's kind of like reducing the regulatory burden. So
exactly.
It's not just on the client or the company's burden that they're reducing. It's taking time away from state agencies, federal agencies that are more dealing with more project specific work from individuals or other companies that have a little bit more complex type project work.
Exactly. Yeah. And they said, oh, these guys are just mowing again, nothing to worry about. But along with that, you have to have an environmental inspector, me, on site. And if he notices anything like, the other day we found a bat cave, that has to be reported, and that changes the ball game, right? Or if like there's a songbird nest during, the spring, that changes things. So it's not just a get out of jail free card. It comes with checks and balances. So, and within that, they provided avoidance and minimization measures, which like for each species, there's this flow chart where you go through and you determine, all right, we're doing this activity during this time of year. So that means we have to do this to prevent harm to that species. And that varies by species and activity. So it covers land all across these 14 different states, basically all the way from the Gulf up into New England. And it only covers those 42 approved species, but that's quite a bit. But it's important to remember that if you do something outside of what you're approved for this project, it may still have a permit requirement or may require mitigation. And I'll get into mitigation more here in a minute. And the whole thing is informed by this Conservation Fund Green Infrastructure Plan. And so when the client got together to begin this whole process, they basically create a panel of NGOs, state agencies, federal agencies, different stakeholder groups, and they work to create this green infrastructure plan, which is basically a managed network of natural lands, working landscapes, open spaces that provide ecosystem value and function that may benefit humans in a lot of cases, but definitely benefits the 42 species that are on the list. And it's a framework. It's not meant to determine explicit mitigation measures, but it's like a decision-making framework that covers that. And so, from the get-go, they had a lot of planning involved here. And then this is the kind of thing that you guys have probably seen in your textbooks. This is kind of what drives the whole network. Is basically the client has basically huge corridors up and down the entire East Coast, and they want to be able to use those as corridors to connect habitat of these 42 listed species. And so they know where their population hubs are. Let's say the Indiana bat, we have an idea of like core areas or important habitat for Indiana bat. And then we have areas that could be possible habitat that aren't occupied or aren't occupied all the time. And then we have, corridors or links that could be used to connect all of that. And so that's the kind of the framework they're coming from. And so any of their mitigation has to consider this and work within that plan. At the time of inception, it was the biggest green infrastructure network of its kind in the country. And this is not proprietary. They release all this information to the public and to other companies and to the government to utilize. So trying to do something for the public good here. Again, another model, something you guys have probably seen in your textbooks. And so you've got your core areas, your population hubs that are connected by the corridors that they establish. So, and mitigation is something that has to happen because unfortunately, sometimes they're going to do things that either damage habitat or do kill individual animals and plants. And, you know, they try their best to minimize and avoid that, but it's going to happen sometimes. And so they have to offset that take and offset that habitat degradation. And they want to do it at a landscape level approach. So rather than just like, all right, we cut down 5 acres of trees here, let's protect 5 acres of trees over there. It's a little more informed than that. It has to be eye for an eye, and it has to fit into that green infrastructure network. They can't just go buy random land wherever. And the conservation fund that I talked about earlier identifies what those opportunities might be, and they have a whole panel that determines what's going to be the best one for that species that matches that that plan. And so you have two kinds of mitigation within our work. You have aggregate, which is for basically long-term operation and maintenance activities, and it's smaller stuff. Think of it as like death by 1,000 cuts, right? So if it works on a 7-year cycle, and they know that certain activities like herbicide application or tree trimming are going to not in themselves do harm to the species or habitat, but their cumulative impacts will. And so they acknowledge that those might have a cumulative impact that harms the species overall. And so they try to offset that from the get-go by purchasing and protecting land or creating habitat somewhere. A lot of times that involves like a known bat hibernacula. They'll buy that property around the cave and donate it to the state or something like that. And so that's their way of working against that. But then you have project specific maintenance where if there's known, like if you know you're gonna do direct harm to a species or direct damage to a wetland that's gonna be substantial in that one instance, then you've got to mitigate for that, that specific project. So a good example of this would be, let's say you had to excavate a stream bed that definitely had endangered mussels in it. You're definitely going to do damage to the population. And so you have to do some kind of specific offset to mitigate for that. Or tree clearing, if you were tree clearing during the windows that bats might be utilizing those trees. And I should say that if they were going to do something like damage a stream, they do their best to put it back in the initial condition when they're done. But you know, you have to acknowledge that the damage has been done at that point, and it's going to be a while before those species return. And so I mentioned the mitigation panel. It's states, academics, NGOs, tribes. They're all on the panel, and they determine what the mitigation projects are going to be. Like if you there might be a bunch of different proposals, like, hey, let's buy this property for the state, or hey, let's protect this cave, or hey, let's plant this whole watershed. Let's reforest this watershed. There's all these different proposals, and that panel picks which ones are the best for the mitigation that they need at that time. And the panel makes the recommendations to the client. So it's got to be driven by science, and it's got to be driven by, again, landscape scale conservation. And they can mitigate extra and kind of create like a bank for the future. And then some key elements that I think are pretty important for this project are that they do long-term monitoring and reporting and adaptive management. And so they don't just buy a forest and say, all right, we're done. Or they don't just, let's say, like a lot of companies will plant monarch habitat along their right-of-ways. They don't just throw it out, milkweed out there and be like, all right, we're done. They actually look like, all right, did the seed take, did it actually do what it was supposed to do? And if so, or if not, why? And they adapt to that. So, and they hire people like us to help them with it. And then all of that is, Alex is going to talk more about ArcGIS Online here in a minute, but all of that is monitored in an online database that they're basically keeping track of all of that over time. So, and just an example, I kind of hit on this earlier. I don't want to take up too much of Alex's time, but Indiana Bat is I keep coming back on that because that's a recent project that we did where we identified possible summer roosting habitat on site, and they needed to do some tree clearing and just a little bit along the edges of the right of way. and they have two options. They said, all right, well, they've identified this could be habitat. We can assume they're present and follow the protocol that we need to protect the species, or we can pay somebody to come out here and do a survey to actually misnet for bats. And a lot of times they'll just kind of assume present. So they're just going to assume that the bat is there because that's easier and a little cheaper. But if they want to work inside that window of the summer, if they want to work in the summer window with these guys, they can survey. And if they prove that they're not there, then they can do that work. But you could pay somebody to come out and survey, and then they find the bat and you're back to square one. So. And
I would say that it's been my experience that has worked out in the company's advantage at a particular time. We had one of our clients wanted to clear a right-of-way for a new pipeline that was considered potentially suitable habitat. And it was actually getting later in the season. If they would have waited an extra 4 weeks before they started clearing, that they would have been outside of the window. However, the client was contacted by the construction crew, and they said, hey, if we go ahead and get started, instead of waiting for them the seasonal period to do the construction, for them it's during the season is their slowest time for bats. They said they would cut them a deal, and they would go ahead and save a lot of money in the construction costs if they would do it before the winter season. And the client went ahead and paid us. We conducted the surveys, had permitted biologists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with the Indiana State Agency, DNR, and Ohio DNR. And we conducted 2 weeks of misnet surveys and were able to get the clear, and they started construction early and saved the client a lot of money. So,
but if you found bats, then it wouldn't have changed anything.
Exactly.
You just had to wait. So yeah. So,
risk you take.
It's a gamble. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, we do it for all kinds. We have a couple guys at the company that do scuba diving for endangered mussels and stuff, and mostly the Midwest, right? Occasionally they'll dive in Louisiana because they're insane, but I wouldn't mess with alligators. So anyway, for Indiana bat, because they were identified, sorry for that sidebar, they basically, I mentioned that flow chart earlier, they follow this flow chart to determine what and don't worry about trying to read all that or write it down. I'm just showing you that there is an informed decision-making process here where they determine what their avoidance measures are going to be. And so what we did is, based on the tree clearing that we were going to do, the avoidance was basically don't cut between April 1st and October 15th. And so we told them that at the beginning of March when we finished the survey, and they're like, cool, we got a month. And then the coronavirus happened. And, it was basically a dumpster fire. But they sent us out there to do the work, or sent me out there to do the work last week. And they had a crew out there clearing the trees along the right of way. And everybody just stayed 6 feet apart. So I tell you this because I think it's kind of cool that the Endangered Species Act actually ended up being more important than the health and safety of the employees involved in this work. So that's how big ESA is. And then while we were doing the tree trimming, that's when we discovered the cave. And I don't know if you can see, is my pointer on the screen? Well, you can't. Alex, can you see my pointer? Okay, so that right there, it was on private property, so I couldn't go to it. But that was about a 20-foot wide cavern that just dropped into the ground in this guy's backyard, which was definitely possible bat habitat. So that, one, it was really good we were cutting in the window we were, and two, there's going to be some paperwork involved there, and possibly some mitigation that might be needed. And so I talked about mitigation and what that might entail. Again, that could be acquisition of protected lands, building new wetlands, planting or protecting forests, protecting the caves, install gates at known maternity colonies. So if you guys have ever been to a bat cave that's got a gate that covers it up, sometimes that's funded by projects like this. So, and that's all, again, it's informed decision-making. So they're not just protecting and buying random stuff. They're actually doing an analysis where they're determining I'm not going to go into all the details here, but just know that they're basically determining, where your best places are. They've identified the hotspots here. That's where you want to buy land. That's where you want to protect land for, this particular species, the Indiana bat. And they've done this analysis for each of the 42 species. And so I'll save this for the end in case, if we have time for it. I'm going to switch to Alex and let him talk about his work.
All right, I think, Nathan, you have to.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do it.
That's fine.
Like I said, I'm still learning here. Somebody can tag in and tell me what to do if they need to.
There should be a red box sort of towards the top of your screen that says stop share.
Yeah, should be. It's closed out of the one that I was in earlier for some reason. Here we go. Yeah, so it's giving me just like the list of, I feel like such a goober right now. This is all I can see.
You might have to stop your full screen, escape your full screen.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Boom.
There
Yeah.
you go.
There? Okay. All right, let me go ahead and get started here. So as Nathan mentioned, I'm going to take a little bit different approach on this one. I'm a little bit more, he kind of provided an overview of the kind of things that we do. I'm going to kind of get into a little bit more technical aspect of it and using a case study for one of our pipeline clients and illustrate kind of the field data collection tools that we use in order to conduct our biological surveys. Whether for capital development projects such as new pipeline construction or O&M type projects, operations and management for like anti-corrosion or wind erosion or stream erosion. As Nathan mentioned, you have to go through the environmental permitting planning process. You have to assess each site individually and determine whether or not there's going to be regulatory permitting required. Examples would be Clean Water Act, floodplain permitting, ESA permitting with endangered species, and or SHPO permitting, the State Historical Preservation Office. So in doing that, we recognize that field surveys are going to be required and in order to collect the data in the field. And we utilize an array of geospatial resources and able for us to pick up the data in the field and be able to describe the type of habitat or potential impacts that may occur as a result. So this is just kind of a schematic of a workflow of the typical permitting planning project. You start off with the pre-planning. We use GIS. ArcGIS is our preferred software that we use, and we use the tabletop assessments, which then go into play with the agency consultations, which then roll into the field survey. So this is kind of a linear process that we use. So how do we do this? What tools do we use? Specifically, I like to start off with conducting the tabletop analysis using ArcDesktop, or for some of you folks, the preference may be ArcPro, which does similar things, but I have different opinions of both, but they both all fall underneath the ISRI umbrella, a suite of software. ArcGIS Online, web mapping portal. This is kind of our main driver for project collaboration from folks in different offices. We have, specifically in our energy branch, we have folks from Texas, Louisiana, Virginia, as well as Nathan and I in South Carolina, all working on the same project at the same time. And for us to be able to access the spatial data and the mapping portal through ArcGIS Online has been very, very powerful for us. Next, we get into getting out into the field. We utilize an array of mobile apps. We use the Collector app for our field mapping, for collecting the vector data out there, navigating to the site, accessing sites, and being able to take photos of each one of the sites or any kind of constraints that may occur out there. We also use the Survey 123 app. This is specifically for our wetland delineations or stream delineations. We've created some customized forms that would enable us to collect data efficiently in the field, but also to streamline the reporting aspect of that data collected. And then finally, for a little bit more complex projects, and I'll get into detail with these more specifically later, we utilize the ArcGIS's desktop operations dashboard for kind of a single snapshot of particular progress of a project. So starting off with Arc Desktop, again, tabletop assessment, we're able to overlay many different vector data layers onto DEM or LiDAR data, USGS topo maps, aerial imagery, and it at least allows us to kind of get an understanding of what to anticipate before we get out in the field. And this kind of drives our permitting matrix as well, in anticipation of, you know, what kind of field effort is going to be required for the project as a whole. We also use Arc Desktop for your figure generation, as well as maintaining the spatial data in the form of a geodatabase, which may need to be delivered to the client as well as a state regulatory agent. This is an example of one of our pipeline projects that we conducted back in 2019. Basically, it's a series of 61 dig sites that we had on an anomaly project in which the client needed to go out and excavate to the pipeline, sandblast the site, and then recoat the pipeline based off of the anomaly that came up from the pig reports. And these are an example of the figures that we generated from the desktop assessment, showing the NWI layers, here polygons, as well as the NHD polylines. And in this particular instance, we had FEMA floodplain adjacent to these specific sites. And again, all this gets ranked and processed into a tabular form for a permit matrix, and recognizing that certain counties that certain projects may occur in may have different thresholds for permitting, specifically floodplain permitting. So those kind of things drive the permitting process or the proposal process, so that we go back to the client and say, this is what we anticipate the scope of the project may require as far as funds and longevity. It also highlights particular projects that may trigger what we anticipate extensive permitting. And so that allows, we can prioritize that for our field surveys. Back to our ArcGIS Online. Again, this was a web mapping portal. We make web maps with it. Again, it's great for sharing and collaborating for project team, as well as the interaction with the client for constructability state considerations. They're able to actually be able to go back and forth with the client and be able to potentially avoid or minimize potential impacts. So AGOL is something that we utilize quite frequently. And it's pretty intuitive. Most people are familiar with using Google Earth or other mapping portals, and ArcGIS Online is pretty powerful in that aspect. Again, same project. There are 61 dig sites. They span 5 counties in southern South Carolina. And this is a screenshot view of the AGOL. And as you zoom in, you get to actually see each one of our sites. We went ahead and color coded the sites to allow us an understanding as the field teams were conducting the field visits, what potential impacts or constraints they encountered. It also allowed the project teams back in the office to be able to provide updates to the client in near real time. So as we're in the field, we're actually using the collector app to update these features, the attributes and the features which change the color coding.
Your boss can tell if you're taking a nap too. The
Yeah.
colors haven't changed on the dots in a while.
Yeah. Next is our, we're going to our mobile apps here, our collector app. Again, that's, the collector app is something that you load onto your cell phone here. It's has the same zoom in, zoom out functionalities with it. But we go ahead for, per Army Corps of Engineers regulations, data that is collected in the field for Clean Water Act must be sub-meter accurate. In the old days, we used the Geo Explorers or the Geo 7Xs, Trimble's GPS units, but it doesn't have very much functionality with it when it comes to navigating. You have just basic vector data sets, but being able to utilize the R1, which is about the size of a old school beeper, clip it to your vest. You can actually stick it up onto a survey rod in order to increase your reception. Allows us to gain sub-meter accuracy with our data, and then it's Bluetooth into your phone. So all the data that you're collecting is sub-meter accurate. And again, it's very intuitive. I'll give you a little screenshot here of a particular area that you can see each one of the dig sites. And it's nice because, you know, the client highlighted where their potential access to a site was. And of course, we're going to survey the entire site to ensure that there aren't any streams that may need to be crossed. And if so, that may entail an impact. So it's nice being able to navigate to each one of these sites. If necessary, we can digitize new access routes that maybe would need to be cleared or provide, you know, a better alternate route to the site. But it's really nice because you can, each one of these sites may only be a quarter mile apart from each other, but they, once you finish up a site, you can identify the next site, and it can actually allow you to navigate using Apple Maps or Google Maps. It'll give you driving directions how to get to the next site, which greatly increases the speed of your field effort. And for this particular example, we had picked up a couple of wetland points on this route. So the client was considering coming in from the north down to the project route and realized that that was going to end up being a permitting constraint. So we ended up coming in from the south. Next is our survey 123. This is specifically for it's customizable web form. So basically, it's not too difficult to develop your web form that you would see on your screen on your phone or iPad or other Android tablet. But it performs the same functions of being able to collect data. However, it's a little bit more functional in being able to collect a little bit more complex data. Specifically, we use forms for our wetland delineation, in which we pick up at least a bare amount of data in the field that we then that include photographs of the soil pits. I think Nathan had a screenshot of that, as well as habitat photos. But we ultimately end up recording all of our wetland data forms, and then we're able to export those into our Excel workbook. And the workbook is what allows us to do the calculations for dominance and the prevalence tests and some of the other calculations that you just really can't do in the field. So the Survey 123 is very intuitive again, and very functional for us. So everything from Survey 123 gets pushed up to AGOL in near real time. And they also include ordinary high watermark stream data forms that we use pretty frequently. So with the mobile apps, the last resource that we typically use is the operations dashboard. These are typically for more complex projects that we have. The 61 dig sites was a pretty complicated, complex project, and tracking which sites needed to be visited, which sites had constraints, which sites had impacts, which sites required permitting. And the operations dashboard is something that we've been able to have our client, if they have an organizational account with ArcGIS, that they are able to access this portal, and it's helpful for maybe your typical project managers for the client to be able to communicate with their bosses every week the status of one of the 61 dig sites. So an example for our project down in South Carolina, this one, you can tell on the top left here, we have a list of all of our sites, so they can intuitively be able to pick up a site. They can then, it automatically maps to that site and selects the site. And then all of the photos and attribute data that was collected during the site visit is straight up, comes up in this pop-up. We also track each one of the sites that were color-coded. So pink indicating it was a cleared site, meaning there was no access constraints, no wetlands, no TNE habitat potential suitability. The cleared sites were in pink, and out of the 61 during the field assessments, we had 51 that were cleared, and 10 of them required permits. So this is a single one-stop shop snapshot of your project that's up to date in near real time. A great example of this, and during the current crisis right now, is the Johns Hopkins University has a really great organizational dashboard that's free to the public that you can look at. That's nice in the fact that they've been able to show data not necessarily on a state level, how many cases or infections there are, but also you can drill down to a county level and see how many cases you have. I think it's updated daily or multiple times during the day. So just a recommendation there. So these are the kind of projects that we use our field data collection. We have templates set up. We have a workflow that's designed to streamline getting the data from the field to the office for the reporting, and ultimately get the client the permits required to actually do the work. We utilize this for mussel surveys, as Nathan mentioned, cultural surveys. We've used this on spill responses, in which time is of the essence. Streamlining and efficiency is the highest priority, and these tools and resources that I just showed is one of the things that makes us stand apart from our competitors, and allows us to increase our field experience. So, you know, how can academia get involved? What kind of things can we use and share with you, the academia folks? I kind of wrote down a couple of bullet points here that I think that there's opportunities for research in some of our long-term monitoring sites, whether wetland sites or, as Nathan mentioned, the environmental inspection, which you need to see how certain stormwater control methods, how successful they were. I think there's some long-term research that could be useful in conducting that research. Joint venture on complex, challenging projects, USDA, U.S. Forest Service, other state and federal agencies. Sometimes they have very large grants available that in which private consultants as well as universities can sometimes partner together and being able to you know, go after a grant. Collaboration of innovative technologies. I'm a big proponent, as I showed earlier, the survey 1 through 3 data forms. I'd love to try to get those streamlined and try to get maybe some code written to have those automatically updated, and use probably some folks that know pretty good code to be able to do that. So. And then finally, mentoring and corporate internship opportunities. I think that's, you know, we have experience. I have experience. It's great to share that with other people, and being able to have internships. A lot of the folks that I work with now, they all started off with internships. It's an excellent opportunity to get your feet wet in this field, whether you like it. Some people like it. Some people don't. It just kind of depends on your personality and other factors, but it's a great opportunity to try to collaborate together on that. And with that, it concludes my section. I don't know if we're going to go to a Q&A.
Yeah, we can. I'm going to drop the last couple slides I had and we'll just do questions. Although my question slide was better, it had salamanders on it. Oh.
Whichever you prefer.
Okay. So students, unmute yourself if you have a question, and you can even turn your webcam on if you want the speaker to see who's talking.
Hey, Alex and Nathan, thank you so much for the presentation. I guess I'm curious to know, for your guys' company, how much does state-to-state travel factor in your field surveys? Are you guys based in South Carolina? Is it dependent on where the office locations are, or do you travel across the country to do your field work?
It depends. I'm based actually just up the road. I live in Pelzer. And then Alex works remote. He's actually in Georgia, but works for us in South Carolina. And the majority of our work, I guess, is in South Carolina. But we do, like you said, we have offices in Louisiana, Texas, Virginia. And so we travel to those places and do work there. But then those clients have projects all over the country. And so we might have a connection with a client in Louisiana, and they're doing a project in Indiana, so they send us to Indiana. So we do a good bit of travel, a good bit of flying. And so, yeah, so what's going on right now is definitely impacting us. But yeah, we do a good bit of interstate travel. Alex got to go to California last year and play around in the Sierras.
Yeah, California was a nice trip. We've done, it depends on the typical project type. We've had been fortunate enough to work on projects for a prospective gold mining site that we had basically lived in northern Elko, Nevada. And but we were able to do T&E species habitat assessments and surveys for burrowing owl, pygmy rabbit. We did seeps and springs studies. We did a lot of stream Rosgen cross sections on all the various mountain streams of the area that they were looking to impact. So Nevada, as Nathan mentioned, pipeline companies that we could work all throughout Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. At this point, for our work that we have, we do have specific authorization from our clients. They've provided us with forms,
Travel vouchers or whatever.
letters
Yeah.
that say basically, you know, hey, this contractor is performing critical work for the safety of our infrastructure, and it's something that we have to carry with us when we are traveling.
And we don't just work for pipelines. We do, I mean, that's a lot of what we've been doing lately, but we do work for all kinds of different, clients. We're within the energy branch, but I mean, I've done stuff for landfills and municipalities and, whoever. So it's more diverse than that.
Hey, Nathan, and Alex, I've got a question. Nathan, you mentioned the new guidance on waters in the United States. So there's the 2020 rule that that the Trump administration has issued. But it sounded like that's not in place yet. So you guys are aware of that, but that's you're not being asked to make wetland assessments based on that yet. Is that what I understood?
Alex could definitely get into this too, but it's passed, right? And it's outside of that public comment period. But Alex, you have to explain, it's not totally implemented at this time, right?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we have not, we've had projects in which our clients are pushing back some of their permitting that they are wanting to do until the rule takes in effect. So everybody does recognize, they know what the writing is on the wall, but the districts haven't put that in place, what their guidance is going to be on that. So that, and I'm sure the litigation aspect of those projects, that it's still kind of up in the air. At the end of the day, we're still delineating wetlands. We're still performing the biological field surveys the same, whether, if something is jurisdictional or not jurisdictional, that has no relevance. If it's a wetland, we're going to delineate it and worry about the jurisdictionality of it on the permitting aspect of it.
Like you said, that basically the Charleston Corps office is going to have the final word whenever they put that document out. It just hasn't happened yet.
Great, thanks.
And then, the state may come forward and fill in whatever gap might have been created by that policy change. We don't know. So
sure, there's certain states that have their own isolated wetlands program. It's separate from the Section 404 permitting process. So Ohio, to be specific. So the jurisdictionality questions there are gonna still stay the same.
good question.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Internship opportunities, I would probably say work closely with your advisor. At this point, under the circumstances, we're still in limbo right now. And but if some opportunities do come up, definitely we would reach out to faculty and certain advisors and let them be aware of that.
We don't even know what our field work is going to be like in the coming months in terms of what the client's going to want to do and what we're going to be allowed to do. So
I think we're going to the field next week.
Well, yeah, I mean, essential or whatever, right? So I may be sleeping in a tent, so I don't have to check into a hotel. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you both so much for doing this and for making the switch to online. I think it was very informative to a lot of students who have maybe heard about consulting but didn't know a whole lot about what it is you guys actually do. I guess we will wrap this up because people are starting to leave the room, but someone has just sent you a question. I was going to say that we can leave the room open if people want to continue asking questions.
I'm flexible.
Yeah.
And let's leave the room open for a few more minutes, but just everybody give you a thank you for doing this.
Alex, you're just A Mathis, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just sent our email addresses there in the message in the chat there. If you can't see it, let us know.
Hey, Nathan and Alex, this is my name is Hunter Morton. So kind of had a quick question for you. I actually I'll be working at a school in McCormick coming in July. And it's basically going to be like a governor school for agricultural purposes. And so one of the things that we're going to do for our students is basically bring in people to kind of give a overview of different careers in the environmental field. I just wonder if either one of you be interested in coming down one of the, and maybe, once all this kind of gets out of the way and the school starts in August to give a brief presentation on kind of like what you did here for the students and kind of just elaborate on how your backgrounds got into the field and kind of what routes they should go if they wanted to pursue a career like yours.
Yeah, I think we could do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very unique type career that we're in. It's not something that you necessarily go to school for, but it is what you go to school, you gain the tools that you need to do this career. So yeah, I'd be more than happy to help out. Nathan is typically really enjoys this kind of stuff. So
yeah. So
great. Well, I'll get your email from what you put in the chat and shoot you both the emails here in the next couple weeks or so, and we'll get you on the books.
sounds good.
sounds good.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Still have 19 people. They're either asleep or they're really shy.
Or they have higher priorities.
I'm actually really sad that we're not getting to go to Nick's after this. I was looking forward to that all spring, and then coronavirus came in. Well, I hope it's not dead. It'll come back, I hope.
I guess I'll end the meeting.
Okay.
Sit here. Okay. Thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, thanks for letting us talk.
Thanks, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Bye.
Everybody have a good weekend.
We'll see you.